people are corrupt. I need you both to throw these people out of my daddy's plane immediately.
The entire cabin fell silent as the little girl stood up, walked to the intercom and said 5 words that would change everything. This is my father's airline. Passengers froze mid-conversation. Flight attendants stopped in their tracks. And the woman who had spent the last 30 minutes trying to get this child thrown off the plane? Her face went completely white. But how did we get here? How did an 8-year-old girl end up standing at the front of a first-class cabin, about to deliver one of the most powerful speeches ever recorded on an airplane? To understand that, we need to rewind 3 hours, to a sunny afternoon at Miami International Airport, where a little girl with a worn backpack was about to board a flight that would change lives forever. Her name was Pearl Hammond. 8 years old, with careful eyes that seemed to notice everything and miss nothing. She stood in the first-class boarding line at gate B-17, wearing her school uniform, a navy blue skirt and white polo shirt that was slightly wrinkled from a full day of classes. Her backpack, faded at the corners and covered in doodles of airplanes, hung from one small shoulder. Inside that backpack were notebooks filled with sketches, detailed drawings of aircraft designs, wing configurations, engine schematics, calculations that would impress most high school students, let alone a third grader. Pearl had been drawing airplanes for as long as she could remember. It was something she'd inherited from her mother, a brilliant aerospace engineer who had helped design components for the very type of aircraft Pearl was about to board. Her mother had passed away when Pearl was only 4 years old, leaving behind a daughter who clung to every memory, every story, every shared dream of flight and engineering and reaching for the sky. Since then it had been just Pearl and her father, George Hammond. And George had raised his daughter to be strong, to be independent, to stand up for what was right. He'd also raised her to be humble, to never use his name or position to get special treatment. Which is why, on this particular afternoon, Pearl was boarding Flight 2847 to New York completely alone, carrying a simple economy ticket that her father's assistant had upgraded to first class as a surprise, Pearl's reward for straight A's on her recent report card. This was her first time flying alone. Her first time in first class. Her first time doing something this grown-up without her father beside her. She was excited, nervous, and trying very hard to appear calm and confident as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. The agent smiled warmly at her. Pearl smiled back, grateful for the kindness, and walked down the jetway with her head held high. When she entered the aircraft, a flight attendant greeted her at the door. Diana Chen, 28 years old, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Diana had been working for Skyline Airways for 6 years, and she loved her job despite the challenges. The long hours, the difficult passengers, the exhaustion that came with her third double shift that week. But moments like this, welcoming a child traveling alone, reminded her why she'd chosen this career. Diana checked Pearl's boarding pass and her unaccompanied minor documentation. Everything was in order. Pearl Hammond, seat 2A, first-class window seat. Diana walked Pearl to her seat personally, showing her where to store her backpack, how to use the entertainment system, where the call button was if she needed anything. Pearl listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked Diana with a kind of genuine politeness that made Diana's heart warm. As Pearl settled into seat 2A, she immediately pulled out her favorite notebook, the one with the most detailed airplane sketches. She had plans to design a new wing configuration during the flight, something more fuel-efficient than current models. It was ambitious for an 8-year-old, sure, but Pearl had never been interested in doing things that were easy. She opened to a fresh page and began sketching, her pencil moving with careful precision across the paper. The hum of passengers boarding faded into background noise as she lost herself in the familiar comfort of drawing, calculating, creating. That's when they arrived. The Cross family boarded about 10 minutes later, sweeping into the first-class cabin like they owned the place. And in their minds they practically did. Lauren Cross, late 40s, blonde hair perfectly styled even for a 3-hour flight, wearing a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Every piece of jewelry she wore screamed wealth. The tennis bracelet, the diamond studs, the rings that caught the light with every gesture. Behind her came Jason Cross, early 50s, the kind of businessman who checked his Rolex every few minutes as if timing the universe itself. He wore an expensive suit despite the casual nature of air travel, his leather briefcase worn in that way that suggested quality rather than age. Their twin sons, Kennedy and George, both 16, followed with the bored entitlement of teenagers who'd flown first class so many times it had lost any sense of novelty. Both were glued to their phones, designer headphones already in place, barely acknowledging the flight attendants who greeted them. The Cross family were Diamond Elite members, Lauren made sure everyone knew. They flew this route twice a month, always in first class, always in row 2 when they could book it. It was their preferred row, close to the front, away from the galley noise, positioned perfectly for quick deplaning. Except today row 2 was occupied. Lauren noticed immediately. Her eyes landed on Pearl in seat 2A, and something flickered across her face. Confusion, then irritation, then something harder to define but impossible to miss. Jason was checking their boarding passes. They were in row 3 today. He shrugged it off. Row 3 was perfectly fine, barely any difference from row 2, but Lauren had already stopped in the aisle, staring at the little girl who'd taken what she clearly considered her seat. Pearl felt the weight of that stare. She looked up from her notebook, met Lauren's eyes for just a moment, then returned to her sketching. She'd learned from her father not to engage with negativity, to focus on what mattered, to let other people's judgments roll off like water off wings. But Lauren wasn't the type to let things go. She settled into seat 3B with visible displeasure, while Jason took 3A and the twins sprawled into 3C and 3D. As Jason stored their carry-ons in the overhead compartment, Lauren leaned close to him, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the row in front of them. I didn't realize they were letting unaccompanied minors in first class now. Seems like a liability. The words hung in the air like smoke. Other passengers glanced over. Diana, who was helping another passenger nearby, tensed but kept her professional smile in place. Pearl's hand tightened around her pencil. The tip pressed harder into the paper, leaving a darker line than she'd intended. But she didn't look up. She didn't respond. She just kept drawing even though the numbers and curves were starting to blur a little. Jason muttered something to Lauren, probably asking her to drop it, to not make a scene, but Lauren's jaw was set in that way that suggested she was just getting started. Diana finished helping the other passenger and moved through the cabin, checking seat belts, closing overhead bins, doing all the pre-flight tasks she'd done thousands of times before. But her eyes kept drifting back to row 2 and row 3, to the little girl bent over her notebook and the woman whose displeasure seemed to be growing rather than fading. Diana had seen this before. Not often but enough times to recognize it. The way some passengers looked at others, the subtle and not so subtle ways they communicated that someone didn't belong. She'd experienced it herself on occasion. Comments about her accent even though she'd been born in California, assumptions about her role, questions about her qualifications. She hoped it would settle. Hoped that once they were in the air, once everyone was comfortable and distracted by movies or work or sleep, the tension would dissipate. She had no idea that in less than 30 minutes, she'd be offered $500 to remove that little girl from her seat. She had no idea that this flight would become the most significant one of her career. She had no idea that the quiet child in seat 2A was about to teach an entire cabin full of people what real power looked like. At the back of the first-class cabin, Elizabeth Park, the chief flight attendant, was conducting her own pre-flight checks. Elizabeth was 34, Korean-American, with 12 years of experience that had taught her how to handle just about any situation with calm authority. She'd dealt with medical emergencies, unruly passengers, emergency landings, and every possible kind of human drama at 35,000 feet. She noticed Diana's tension, caught the anxious glance her colleague threw toward row 2. Elizabeth made a mental note to check in once boarding was complete, but for now, everything seemed under control. Pearl was still drawing. Her wing design was taking shape, a modified Delta configuration with enhanced fuel efficiency and reduced drag. She added small notations about materials, stress calculations, potential improvements. Her mother had taught her the basics before she died, and Pearl had spent the last 4 years teaching herself the rest through library books, online courses, and sheer determination. She wanted to be an aerospace engineer just like her mom. She wanted to design planes that could fly farther, cleaner, safer. She wanted to make her father proud. She wanted to honor her mother's memory. And she absolutely refused to let some stranger's rudeness ruin her first solo flight. The boarding process continued. More passengers filed into economy. The overhead bins filled up. Diana and the other flight attendants moved through their choreographed routines with practiced efficiency. But in row 3, Lauren Cross was still staring at the back of Pearl's head, her irritation hardening into something more deliberate. She leaned toward Jason again, whispering something Diana couldn't quite hear. Jason shook his head, clearly wanting no part of whatever his wife was planning. But Lauren's expression suggested she'd already made up her mind about something. And when Lauren Cross made up her mind, she didn't let go easily. The cabin doors were still open. Passengers were still boarding. Everything seemed normal, routine, unremarkable. But beneath that surface calm, something was building. A confrontation that would expose the ugly reality of bias, test the integrity of good people, and ultimately give one 8-year-old girl the chance to show the world what courage really looks like. The flight to New York was scheduled to take 3 hours. But the next 30 minutes would contain enough drama, emotion, and raw human truth to fill a lifetime. And it all started with a woman who believed her money and status gave her the right to decide who belonged where, facing a child who was about to teach her that real power has nothing to do with platinum status or designer clothes. Before we continue with what happened next, do me a favor, if you're finding this story as powerful as I am telling it, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens in the next few minutes is something you absolutely need to see. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. And here's a question for you. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly in public? Did you speak up or did you stay silent? Let me know in the comments because Pearl's story is about to show us what speaking up really looks like. Now let's get back to that airplane, where a senior flight attendant named Diana was about to face the most difficult decision of her career. The boarding process was winding down. Most passengers had found their seats, stowed their luggage, and settled in for the flight. The usual pre-departure sounds filled the cabin. The rustle of magazines, the beep of seatbelt buckles, the murmur of quiet conversations. Diana moved through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency, checking that overhead bins were secure and seat backs were in their upright positions. She was hoping, really hoping, that the tension she'd sensed earlier would just fade away. That Lauren Cross would get absorbed in a book or a movie, that Pearl would continue her quiet sketching, that the flight would proceed without incident. But Diana had been doing this job long enough to know that hope and reality don't always align. She was adjusting an overhead bin near row 5 when she heard it. Lauren's voice, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the ambient noise. "Excuse me. Excuse me, flight attendant." Diana turned, her professional smile already in place, and walked back toward row 3. Lauren was half standing in her seat, one perfectly manicured hand raised like she was hailing a taxi. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Lauren gestured toward Pearl, who was still bent over her notebook, pencil moving across the page. "Is that child really flying alone in first class? She can't be more than 9 or 10. The question landed in the quiet cabin like a stone dropping into still water. Nearby passengers glanced up. Pearl's pencil stopped moving, though she didn't look up. Diana kept her voice calm, professional, the tone she'd perfected over 6 years of dealing with every kind of passenger imaginable. "Ma'am, I can assure you all our passengers have been properly checked in and cleared for travel. Every person on this aircraft has a valid ticket and has met all necessary requirements." But Lauren wasn't satisfied. Her voice grew louder, ensuring that not just Diana but everyone in the surrounding rows could hear her. "I'm not comfortable with this. My sons need their space, and frankly, a child that young shouldn't be in this cabin without supervision. What if she gets disruptive? What if she starts crying or having a tantrum? We paid premium prices for this cabin, and I don't think it's appropriate to have unaccompanied children here." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Several passengers were openly staring now. Kennedy and George, the Cross twins, looked embarrassed, both of them sinking lower in their seats, their phones suddenly very interesting. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. And then Pearl looked up. Her voice was quiet but absolutely clear, carrying the kind of dignity that made several passengers unconsciously straighten in their seats. "I'm 8 and I can hear you." Lauren's expression shifted, rearranging itself into something that was probably meant to look kind but came across as condescending. She leaned forward slightly, tilting her head in that way adults sometimes do when they're about to talk down to a child. "Oh honey, I'm not talking about you specifically. I'm sure you're a very well-behaved little girl. I just think you'd be more comfortable in the main cabin with the other families. There are probably other children back there, kids your own age. Wouldn't that be more fun than sitting up here all alone?" Pearl held Lauren's gaze for a long moment. There was something in those 8-year-old eyes that made Lauren blink first. A steadiness, a quiet strength that seemed far older than her years. "I'm comfortable here," Pearl said, her voice still calm, still measured. "This is my assigned seat." Diana felt a surge of pride for this brave little girl, but she also felt the situation escalating. She needed to de-escalate, to restore order, to get this flight moving before things got worse. "Mrs. Cross," she said, keeping her tone respectful but firm, "as I mentioned, all our passengers are properly ticketed and cleared for travel. I'm going to need to ask you to settle in for departure now. We'll be pushing back from the gate shortly." Jason reached over and touched Lauren's arm. "Lauren, let it go. She's just a kid. It's fine." For a moment it seemed like maybe that would be the end of it. Lauren sat back in her seat, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Diana moved away, continuing her pre-flight checks, her heart beating a little faster than normal. But she'd only made it 2 rows back when she heard Lauren's voice again, this time in a harsh whisper that was somehow louder than her previous speaking volume. Diana. Diana, I need to speak with you. Privately. Diana closed her eyes for just a second, gathering her patience, then turned back. Lauren had stood up and was gesturing toward the galley area at the front of the cabin, away from the seats. This wasn't good. Diana knew it wasn't good. But she was a professional, and professionals handled difficult situations with grace. She walked to the galley and Lauren followed, with Jason trailing reluctantly behind his wife. Once they were in the small galley space, partially shielded from the passenger seats, Lauren's voice dropped to what she probably thought was a confidential tone, though it was still plenty loud enough for anyone paying attention to hear. Look, I don't want to make a scene, Lauren began, which was ironic given that she'd already made one, but I have some serious concerns about the appropriateness of having that child in this cabin. Safety concerns. What if there's an emergency? What if she panics? She's far too young to be responsible for herself up here. Diana took a breath. Ma'am, as I've explained, she's been cleared as an unaccompanied minor. She has all the proper documentation. I don't care about documentation, Lauren cut her off. I care about the experience I paid for. We fly this route twice a month. We're Diamond Elite members. We specifically choose first class to avoid exactly this kind of situation. This kind of situation? Diana repeated, her professional mask starting to slip just slightly. I'm not sure I understand what situation you're referring to. The young passenger has been completely quiet and well-behaved. Lauren waved her hand dismissively. That's not the point. The point is it's inappropriate. Surely you can see that. Can't you just quietly move her to economy? Tell her there's been some kind of mix-up? Give her some extra snacks or something to make up for it? Diana's jaw tightened. Mrs. Cross, I cannot and will not move a passenger who has a valid first-class ticket to economy. That's not how this works. Everything's negotiable, Lauren said, and there was something calculating in her eyes now. Jason, show her. And that's when things crossed a line that Diana had never experienced in 6 years of flying. Jason, looking deeply uncomfortable, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, though Pearl, from her seat in 2A, had a perfect view of the galley, and she was watching very carefully indeed. From his wallet, Jason extracted 5 crisp $100 bills. $500. He held them awkwardly, like he wasn't quite sure what to do with them, like he'd been handed a live snake. Lauren took over, her voice smooth now, almost friendly. Diana, is it? Look, I'm going to be direct because I respect your time and mine. We fly this route twice a month. We're Diamond Elite members, as I mentioned. That girl is making us uncomfortable, not because of anything she's done specifically but because we paid for a certain experience. A certain level of exclusivity. The word, exclusivity, hung in the air like poison. Diana stared at the money in Jason's hand, then at Lauren's face, then back at the money. Her mind was racing. Was this really happening? Were these people really trying to bribe her to remove a child from her seat? Lauren continued, apparently mistaking Diana's shocked silence for consideration. We're willing to make this worth your while. Jason, show her properly. Jason, his face flushed, spread out the $500 bills like a fan. We'd like you to find her a seat in economy. Just tell her there's been an overbooking issue in first class, that there was a mistake with her ticket. We'll make sure this gets to you personally. He gestured with the cash. Plus we'll put in a glowing review about your service. We'll mention you by name to corporate. This could be really good for your career. Diana felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. In all her years of flying, she dealt with drunk passengers, belligerent passengers, passengers who tried to sneak into first class or steal extra meals or bend every rule imaginable. But this was different. This was calculated. This was deliberate. This was wrong on a level that made her hands shake. Her voice came out harder than she'd ever used with a passenger. Sir, ma'am, I cannot and will not move a passenger who has a valid ticket. What you're suggesting is... It's a simple request, Lauren interrupted, her voice taking on an edge now. You're making this difficult. And I don't think you understand who you're talking to. Do you know who we are? Jason is on the advisory board for 3 major corporations. I sit on 2 charity boards. One call from us and your supervisor will hear about your lack of customer service. 1 email to corporate about how you refuse to accommodate Diamond Elite members and... I need you both to return to your seats, Diana said, and she was proud that her voice didn't shake. Now. Lauren's face transformed. The fake friendliness evaporated, replaced by something ugly and raw. This is ridiculous. You're being ridiculous. I want to speak to whoever's in charge. I want your supervisor. Right now. You can file a complaint after we land, Diana said. But right now you need to return to your seats so we can prepare for departure. Jason grabbed Lauren's arm. Lauren, come on. Let's just drop this. It's not worth it. But Lauren shook him off. No. This is unacceptable. I'm not letting this go. She turned and stalked back to row 3, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. Jason followed, still holding the $500, shoving them back into his wallet with fumbling hands that suggested shame he wasn't quite willing to acknowledge. Diana stood in the galley, her heart pounding, her hands actually trembling now. She looked down at them, surprised by her own physical reaction. She'd been yelled at before. She'd been threatened before. But she'd never been offered money to discriminate against a passenger. Never been asked to lie to a child. Never felt quite so disgusted by another human being's behavior. And from seat 2A, Pearl had seen and heard everything. Pearl sat very still, her notebook forgotten in her lap. Her heart was beating fast and she felt something tight and hot in her chest. Anger, yes, but also something else. Confusion. The awful realization that someone could look at her and decide, just from looking, that she didn't belong somewhere. She'd heard stories like this. Her father had prepared her, in age-appropriate ways, for the reality that some people in the world would judge her unfairly. But hearing about it and experiencing it were two entirely different things. She watched Lauren return to her seat, practically throwing herself into it. Watched Jason settle beside his wife, looking miserable. Watched the twins, Kennedy and George, exchange glances that suggested they knew their mother had gone too far. Kennedy leaned toward Lauren and said, quietly enough that he probably thought no one else could hear, "Mom, why do you even care? Just ignore her. She's not bothering anyone." Lauren's response was sharp. "It's the principle, Kennedy. We paid for exclusivity. We paid for a certain standard. And that standard doesn't include having children running around unsupervised in first class." "She's not running around," Kennedy pointed out with the kind of teenage logic that was both accurate and unhelpful. "She's literally just sitting there." "Don't argue with me," Lauren snapped. "You don't understand business. You don't understand how these things work." Pearl turned back to her notebook, but she couldn't focus on her wing design anymore. The curves and angles blurred together. She'd lost her train of thought, lost the careful calculations she'd been working through. She pulled out her phone instead, a simple model, nothing fancy, the kind parents give their kids for emergencies. It had exactly 3 numbers programmed in: her father's cell, her father's office, and 911. Her finger hovered over her father's number. George Hammond had always told her to handle things herself when possible. To be strong, to be independent, to solve her own problems. He taught her that running to him for every little difficulty wouldn't help her grow into the capable, confident woman he knew she could be. But he'd also taught her to recognize when something was beyond her ability to handle alone. When something was truly wrong, not just uncomfortable or difficult. Pearl wasn't sure which category this fell into. She hadn't been physically hurt. She hadn't been actually removed from her seat. Diana had stood up for her, had refused the bribe. But those people had tried to pay someone to get rid of her. Had offered $500, more money than Pearl got for a whole year of allowance, just to not have to sit near her for a few hours. And that felt like something her father should know about. She opened a new text message but didn't type anything yet. She wanted to think about what to say, how to explain what was happening without sounding scared or helpless. Because she wasn't scared. She was angry. And she was starting to form a plan. Meanwhile, in the back galley, Diana had found Elizabeth. Elizabeth Park, the chief flight attendant, was doing a final inventory check, counting meals and beverages, making sure everything was in order for the flight. She looked up when Diana approached and immediately noticed something was wrong. Diana's usual warm composure had cracked. Her hands were shaking slightly, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears of frustration. "Diana? What happened?" Diana glanced around to make sure no passengers were in earshot, then spoke in a low, urgent voice that shook with suppressed anger. "The couple in row 3. The crosses. They just tried to bribe me." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "Bribe you to do what?" "To remove a child from her seat. The little girl in 2A, the unaccompanied minor. They offered me $500 cash to tell her there was an overbooking issue and move her to economy." For a moment, Elizabeth just stared at her. Then her jaw set in a way that Diana recognized. It was the expression Elizabeth got when someone had crossed a line so far that there was no going back. They tried to bribe you, Elizabeth repeated, her voice dangerously quiet, to remove a child from her seat. Diana nodded. Did they give a reason? Diana's laugh was bitter. They said she was making them uncomfortable. That they paid for exclusivity. The woman Lauren kept going on about how they're Diamond Elite members, how her husband is on corporate boards, how they deserve a certain experience. Elizabeth's expression could have frozen fire. They tried to bribe you to remove a child from her seat based on what, exactly? Has she been disruptive? Has she violated any rules? She's been perfect, Diana said. She's just sitting there drawing in a notebook. She's 8 years old and she's been nothing but polite and quiet. Elizabeth was already moving, striding toward the first-class cabin with a purposeful energy that made passengers instinctively lean away. Diana followed, suddenly very grateful that she wasn't on the receiving end of Elizabeth's anger. Elizabeth stopped beside row 3. Lauren was scrolling through her phone, pointedly ignoring everyone around her. Jason was staring out the window. The twins had their headphones on, probably trying to pretend they were somewhere else entirely. Mr. and Mrs. Cross. Elizabeth's voice was professional, controlled, but there was steel underneath it. Lauren looked up, and whatever she saw in Elizabeth's face made her own expression shift from irritation to uncertainty. I understand there's been an incident involving an attempted bribe to my flight attendant. This is a federal offense. The words dropped like stones. Jason went visibly pale. Several passengers in nearby rows turned to stare. Kennedy pulled his headphones down, his eyes wide. Lauren recovered quickly, her face rearranging into indignation. Bribe? That's absurd. Where is this coming from? We simply offered a tip for exceptional service. Is that suddenly illegal? Elizabeth's expression didn't change. A tip for what service specifically? For moving a paying passenger out of her assigned seat based on what grounds? You haven't cited any actual safety concern. You haven't reported any disruptive behavior. So please help me understand what exceptional service you were tipping for. Jason put his hand on Lauren's arm, a clear warning, but Lauren shook him off. I don't appreciate your tone, she said, her voice rising. I don't appreciate being accused of something criminal when all we did was try to ensure we had a comfortable flight. And frankly, I want your name and employee number because this kind of treatment is completely unacceptable. Elizabeth didn't blink. Elizabeth Park, Chief Flight Attendant, employee number 47293. You're welcome to file a complaint. I encourage it, actually. It'll go into the official record along with your attempt to bribe a federal employee to discriminate against a minor passenger. The word, discriminate, hung in the air like a bomb. Jason spoke for the first time, his voice strained. Now wait a minute. Nobody said anything about discrimination. You're putting words in our mouths. Am I? Elizabeth asked. Then please, Mr. Cross, explain to me the legitimate, non-discriminatory reason you wanted a well-behaved 8-year-old girl removed from her assigned first-class seat. Silence. Jason's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a fish drowning in air. Lauren jumped in, her voice sharp with desperation. She's too young to be in first class alone. It's a safety issue. What if there's an emergency? What if? She's cleared as an unaccompanied minor with all proper documentation. Elizabeth cut her off. She's following all safety procedures. Try again. This is harassment, Lauren tried. You're harassing paying customers. Diamond Elite members. We'll be reporting this to corporate and I can guarantee. Mrs. Cross, Elizabeth interrupted and her voice was ice. Right now you have two choices. You can settle into your seats, follow crew instructions and we can depart on time. Or I can call airport security to come have a conversation with you about attempting to bribe a flight attendant, which is a federal offense under Title 18, Section 201 of the U.S. Code. Those are your options. Choose now. The cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger in first class was listening, most of them not even pretending otherwise. This was better than any in-flight entertainment. Jason made the decision for both of them. We'll stay in our seats. We're sorry for the misunderstanding. Lauren, we're done. We're dropping this. Jason, Lauren started. We're done, he repeated, and there was an edge in his voice that suggested he was as close to angry at his wife as he'd ever been. Lauren's face flushed red. Her hands clenched into fists. But she stayed in her seat. Smart choice, Elizabeth said. She turned to address the entire first-class cabin, her voice carrying clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be beginning our departure procedures shortly. Thank you for your patience. As Elizabeth walked back toward the rear galley, Diana caught her eye. There was a moment of silent communication between them, gratitude, solidarity, shared exhaustion. But they both knew this wasn't over. In row 3, Lauren sat rigid in her seat, her phone gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. She leaned close to Jason and hissed, "This isn't over. When we land, I'm filing a complaint that will get both of them fired. I'll make sure they never work for an airline again." Jason didn't respond. He just closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the seat, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. And in seat 2A, Pearl lowered her phone. She'd recorded the entire confrontation. She'd watched Elizabeth defend Diana, watched Diana refuse to be bought, watched these two brave women stand up for what was right even when it would have been easier, safer, more profitable to give in. Pearl had made her decision. She opened the text message to her father and began typing, her small fingers moving quickly across the screen. And with each word she typed, the balance of power on Flight 2847 began to shift in ways that no one, not Lauren, not Jason, not even Elizabeth or Diana, could have anticipated. Because Pearl Hammond wasn't just an 8-year-old girl. She was the daughter of George Hammond, CEO of Skyline Airways. And she was about to teach everyone on this plane a lesson they'd never forget. But before we get to that earth-shattering moment, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly and wished you'd spoken up? Have you ever seen injustice happening right in front of you and wondered if you should get involved? Drop a comment below and let me know, because what happens next is going to show you exactly what speaking up looks like when someone has the courage to do it right. And if you're hooked on this story, if you want to see how Pearl takes control of this entire situation, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because what's coming next is the most satisfying moment of justice you'll see all week. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Now, let's get back to that text message Pearl was typing to her father, and the moment everything changed. The cabin doors closed with that distinctive thunk that every frequent flyer recognizes, the sound of a sealed aircraft, the point of no return. Outside, ground crew disconnected the jetway. Inside, flight attendants moved through their final pre-departure checks with choreographed precision. Diana secured the forward cabin door, running through her mental checklist. Overhead bins closed. Seats upright. Tray tables stowed. Passengers settled, most of them anyway. The confrontation with the Cross family had left her shaken, but she was a professional. She compartmentalized, focused on the tasks at hand, tried not to think about the $500 bills Jason Cross had fanned out like he was playing poker with her dignity. In the cockpit, the pilots were running through their own checklists, communicating with ground control, preparing for pushback. The engines would start soon. In 15 minutes, maybe 20, they'd be wheels up, leaving Miami behind and heading north toward New York. Everything was proceeding normally, routinely, unremarkably. Except for the little girl in seat 2A, who was typing a message on her phone that would change the trajectory of this entire flight. Pearl had been watching everything. Every interaction, every confrontation, every moment of tension between the Cross family and the flight attendants. She'd watched Diana refuse the bribe with a courage that made Pearl's chest feel tight with admiration. She'd watched Elizabeth stand up to Lauren's threats with a calm authority that reminded Pearl of her father. And she'd made her decision. Her fingers moved across the phone screen with careful deliberation. She wanted to get the words exactly right, factual, clear, not emotional or exaggerated. Her father had taught her the importance of accuracy, especially when reporting something serious. She typed, "Dad, something happened on the plane. I'm okay, but I think you should know." She paused, reading it over. "Yes, that was good." It wouldn't alarm him too much. She'd led with, "I'm okay," but it would let him know this was important. She hit send. Then she began typing again, explaining the situation in the same careful, factual way she'd write a book report for school. The woman in row 3 who'd complained about her being in first class. The comment about unaccompanied minors. The way Lauren had tried to convince Diana that Pearl would be more comfortable in economy. And then the bribe, $500 in cash to move Pearl to the back of the plane. She explained how Diana had refused. How Elizabeth had confronted the family. How Lauren had threatened to get them both fired. Pearl typed it all out, her small fingers surprisingly steady, her 8-year-old brain processing the injustice with a clarity that would have impressed most adults. She hit send on the longer message and waited. In his office in New York, George Hammond was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it. He was in the middle of analyzing some concerning fuel cost projections, but something made him glance at the screen. A message from Pearl. His daughter didn't text him during school hours unless it was important. And she should be on a plane right now, shouldn't she? He checked his watch. Yes, her flight was scheduled to depart in the next few minutes. He opened the message. Dad, something happened on the plane. I'm okay, but I think you should know. George's stomach dropped. His finger was already moving to call her when the second, longer message came through. He read it once. Then again. Then a third time, his jaw tightening with each word. Someone had tried to bribe a flight attendant to remove his daughter from her seat. Someone had looked at his 8-year-old little girl, his brilliant, kind, brave daughter who'd already lost her mother and who was flying alone for the first time, trying so hard to be grown up and independent. Someone had looked at her and decided she didn't belong in first class. And George Hammond knew exactly why. It wasn't about her age. It wasn't about safety concerns or appropriate supervision or any of the excuses this woman had apparently made. It was about the color of Pearl's skin, about prejudices so deeply ingrained that this passenger thought she could buy her way out of having to sit near a black child. George's hands were shaking. Not with fear, with rage. The kind of cold, controlled rage that came from being a black man in America who'd built a successful company from nothing, who'd fought against bias and discrimination his entire career, who'd hoped, God, how he'd hoped, that his daughter's generation might face less of it. But here it was. On his own airline. On a flight his daughter was taking alone for the first time. He typed quickly, "Are you safe right now?" The response came within seconds. Yes. The flight attendants protected me. But the family tried to pay them to move me. George felt a surge of gratitude for these flight attendants, Diana and Elizabeth, Pearl had written, who'd stood up for his daughter when it would have been easier, safer for their jobs, to just comply with a Diamond Elite member's request. He would make sure they were recognized for that. Promoted if they wanted it. Bonuses. Public commendation. Whatever they wanted. But first he needed to make sure Pearl was truly okay. He typed, "Stay calm, sweetheart. I'm handling this." He was already opening his laptop, pulling up the passenger manifest for Flight 2847, ready to have the entire Cross family removed from the aircraft and banned from ever flying Skyline Airways again. But then another message from Pearl came through, "I want to handle it myself." George stopped, his finger hovering over his laptop's keyboard. He read the message again. Pearl wanted to handle it herself. His first instinct was to say no. She was 8 years old. This was too much for a child to deal with. This was his job as her father, as the CEO of the airline, as the person responsible for making sure his company didn't tolerate this kind of behavior. But then he thought about Pearl's mother. Maria had been the strongest person George had ever known. An aerospace engineer in a field dominated by men, a Latina woman who'd faced discrimination and doubt at every turn and had responded not with anger or bitterness but with excellence. She'd outworked everyone, outthought everyone, proved herself again and again until even her harshest critics had to acknowledge her brilliance. And she'd taught Pearl to be the same way. Strong. Independent. Capable of standing up for herself. Maria would have wanted Pearl to handle this if she felt ready. George took a breath then typed, "You're your mother's daughter. Do what you think is right. I'm here if you need me." He hit send then added, "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. So proud." In seat 2A, Pearl read her father's messages and felt something warm spread through her chest. Pride, yes, but also certainty. She was doing the right thing. She put her phone away and looked toward the front of the cabin, where Elizabeth was beginning the pre-departure announcements. Elizabeth's voice came over the intercom, professional and clear. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Elizabeth Park, your chief flight attendant. On behalf of Captain Rodriguez and the entire crew, welcome aboard Skyline Airways Flight 2847 with service to New York LaGuardia. We'll be departing shortly, but first, we need to go over some important safety information." Pearl had heard this speech dozens of times. She could probably recite it from memory. But she listened anyway, waiting for the right moment. Elizabeth went through the safety procedures: seatbelts, emergency exits, oxygen masks, flotation devices. Her voice was steady, calm, the voice of someone who'd given this speech thousands of times. As she finished, "We remind you that this is a non-smoking flight, and tampering with or disabling smoke detectors in the lavatories is prohibited by federal law." Lauren's voice carried clearly from row 3. She was speaking to Jason, but her voice was pitched just loud enough that she clearly wanted people to hear. "Finally. Once we're in the air, I'm writing a scathing email to corporate. That Park woman will be lucky to keep her job. And her little friend Diana? I'll make sure they both understand what it means to treat Diamond Elite members this way." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. Kennedy muttered something to his mother that sounded like, "Mom, please," but Lauren ignored him. I'm serious, Jason. By the time I'm done, they'll be lucky to be working security at a shopping mall, let alone flying first-class routes. And maybe corporate will finally understand that they need to be more selective about who they allow in premium cabins. Pearl unbuckled her seatbelt. The click was quiet, but Diana heard it. She was standing near row 4, doing a final visual check of the cabin, and she turned immediately. "Sweetie," she said, moving toward Pearl's seat with concern written across her face, "we need you to stay seated for takeoff. We're about to push back from the gate." Pearl stood up. She was small for her 8 years, and standing in the aisle, she looked even smaller. A little girl in a wrinkled school uniform, her backpack still tucked under the seat in front of her. But there was something in her eyes, something in the set of her shoulders, that made Diana pause. "I need to speak to Miss Elizabeth, please," Pearl said, her voice polite but firm. "It's important." Diana glanced toward the galley, where Elizabeth was stowing the intercom handset. They really did need to prepare for departure. They were already running a few minutes behind schedule. But something in Pearl's tone, in the careful way she was holding herself, made Diana hesitate. "Is everything okay?" Diana asked quietly. "Yes," Pearl said. "But I need to speak to Miss Elizabeth. Please." Diana made a decision based purely on instinct. "Okay. Come with me." She escorted Pearl forward to the galley, where Elizabeth was doing final checks on the emergency equipment. Elizabeth looked up as they approached, her expression shifting from professional efficiency to concern. "Pearl? Is something wrong?" Pearl looked up at this woman who'd defended her, who'd stood up to Lauren Cross with a courage that had made Pearl feel protected and valued and safe. "Miss Elizabeth," Pearl said, her voice clear and steady, "thank you for standing up for me. You and Miss Diana both. I really appreciate it." Elizabeth's expression softened. She knelt down slightly, bringing herself closer to Pearl's eye level. "Of course, sweetheart. That's our job. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" Pearl took a breath. "I'm fine. But I need you to know something. My name is Pearl Hammond." Elizabeth smiled. "I know, honey. I saw it on your boarding pass." "My full name," Pearl continued, "is Pearl Maria Hammond. My father is George Hammond. He owns this airline." For a moment, Elizabeth just stared at her. Then her eyes widened as the connection clicked into place. George Hammond, CEO of Skyline Airways. She'd seen his photo in company newsletters at annual meetings in the leadership section of the employee portal. And now that Pearl had said it, Elizabeth could see the resemblance, not to George, but to the woman who was occasionally pictured beside him in older photos before she'd passed away. Maria Hammond, the aerospace engineer. Pearl had her mother's eyes, her mother's delicate features, her mother's quiet strength. "You're?" Elizabeth started, then stopped, unsure what to say. Pearl nodded. "I don't usually tell people. Dad says I should be treated like everyone else, that I shouldn't use his name to get special treatment or make people act different around me. And I agree with that. But this is different." Diana, standing beside them, looked like she might faint. "You're George Hammond's daughter?" "Yes," Pearl said simply. "And those people in row 3, they tried to bribe you to kick me out of my seat. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because of how I look. Because they decided, just by looking at me, that I didn't belong in first class." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. She'd suspected as much, of course, but hearing it stated so plainly by this 8-year-old child made the injustice even starker. "Pearl," Elizabeth said carefully, "I want you to know that Diana and I would have done the same thing regardless of who your father is. What they did was wrong and we would never have gone along with it." "I know," Pearl said, and there was absolute certainty in her voice. "That's why I want to do this the right way. I could just text my dad and have him remove them from the flight." "You do it?" "He's probably already pulling up the passenger manifest right now." Elizabeth could believe it. If someone had tried to bribe a flight attendant to discriminate against her child, she'd want heads to roll too. "But I don't want to hide behind my dad," Pearl continued. "I want those people to understand what they did. I want them to hear it from me. And I think they need to know that you can't judge people by how they look. That someone you think isn't important might be the most important person on the plane." She paused, then added, "Also, that woman said she's going to get you and Miss Diana fired. And I can't let that happen. You protected me. Now I want to protect you." Elizabeth felt something catch in her throat. This child. This brave, brilliant 8-year-old child who'd been treated with such casual cruelty was now worried about protecting the flight attendants who'd stood up for her. "Pearl," Elizabeth said gently, "what are you asking me to do?" Pearl looked up at her with those serious, thoughtful eyes. "I want to use the intercom. I want to speak to them directly. I won't be mean. I won't yell or call them names. But they need to know what they did and they need to understand that there are consequences. Elizabeth glanced at Diana, who looked simultaneously shocked and moved by what Pearl was proposing. Then she looked back at Pearl. The regulation answer was no. Passengers didn't use the intercom. Children definitely didn't use the intercom. There were protocols, procedures, chains of command. But Elizabeth had been doing this job for 12 years, and she'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the same as the thing the manual said to do. She studied Pearl, really studied her. Saw the steel in her spine, the careful thought behind her eyes, the way she was standing tall despite being scared. This wasn't a child throwing a tantrum or acting on impulse. This was someone who'd thought through what she wanted to say and why it mattered. Your father would approve? Elizabeth asked. Pearl pulled out her phone and showed Elizabeth the text exchange. Elizabeth read George Hammond's words, "You're your mother's daughter. Do what you think is right. I'm here if you need me." Elizabeth made her decision. "Okay," she said. "But I'm standing right here with you. And if at any point you change your mind or you get uncomfortable, you just look at me and we'll stop." "Understood." Pearl nodded, her expression serious. "Understood." Elizabeth reached for the intercom handset, her hand steady despite the voice in the back of her head asking if she was about to make a career-ending decision. But sometimes doing the right thing meant taking a risk. She handed the intercom transmitter to Pearl, then adjusted the height so the 8-year-old could speak into it comfortably. The handset looked huge in Pearl's small hands, the coiled cord stretching between them. "Whenever you're ready," Elizabeth said softly. "Just press this button and speak clearly." Pearl looked at the intercom, then at Elizabeth, then at Diana, who had tears in her eyes and was nodding encouragement. Then Pearl pressed the button. And the entire cabin, every passenger, every flight attendant, every person on Flight 2847, was about to hear exactly what this 8-year-old girl had to say about justice, dignity, and the consequences of judging people by the color of their skin. The intercom crackled to life. And Pearl began to speak. But before we hear what Pearl said, before we get to the most powerful moment in this entire story, I need to ask you something. If you're invested in this story, if you're rooting for Pearl, if you want to see what happens when this brave little girl takes the microphone and speaks her truth, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what comes next is going to be the most satisfying moment of justice you've seen in a long time, and you don't want to miss a single word of what Pearl has to say. Subscribe and let's finish this story together. Now, let's hear Pearl's speech that would change everything. The intercom crackled to life, and the entire cabin went silent. It's amazing how quickly human beings can sense when something unusual is happening. Maybe it's instinct, some evolutionary adaptation that makes us pay attention when the normal pattern breaks. Whatever it was, every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every passenger who'd been scrolling through their phone looked up. Every flight attendant froze in place. Because the voice coming through the speakers wasn't Elizabeth's professional, familiar tone. It wasn't a standard announcement about departure procedures or weather conditions or estimated flight time. It was a child's voice. Clear and steady, yes, but unmistakably young. "Good evening, passengers. My name is Pearl Hammond and I'm 8 years old. I'm in seat 2A. Confused murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, trying to see who was speaking. In economy, people were asking each other what was going on. In first class, everyone was staring at the little girl standing in the galley, holding the intercom handset like it weighed nothing at all, even though her hands were barely big enough to grip it properly. Lauren Cross looked annoyed. That was her first reaction. Annoyance that this child, this same child who'd been the source of all the trouble, was now interrupting the departure process. She rolled her eyes at Jason, a "can you believe this?" expression on her face. She had no idea what was coming. Pearl took a breath, visible even to the passengers in the back rows who were watching her small silhouette against the galley lights. Elizabeth stood beside her, one hand hovering near Pearl's shoulder, not controlling, just supporting. Diana stood on Pearl's other side, her eyes already glistening with tears because she knew, somehow, that whatever was about to happen was going to be significant. Pearl continued, her voice carrying through every speaker in the aircraft with perfect clarity. "About 30 minutes ago, a passenger in this cabin, a woman sitting in row 3, tried to pay our flight attendant $500 to remove me from my seat. Not because I was being loud. Not because I was breaking any rules. But because she decided I didn't belong here." The confused murmurs exploded into shocked whispers. Passengers gasped. Several people said "what?" out loud. In economy, where they'd only heard Pearl's voice without seeing what led up to this moment, People were turning to their seatmates with wide eyes, asking if they'd heard that correctly. In row 3, Lauren's face drained of color. All the blood just left like someone had pulled a plug. Her mouth fell open. Her hands gripped the armrests so hard her knuckles went white. Jason grabbed her arm, leaning close to whisper frantically, but Lauren seemed paralyzed, unable to do anything but stare at the little girl who was calmly, methodically, telling the entire plane exactly what had happened. Pearl wasn't done. She told the flight attendant that I would be more comfortable in the back of the plane. She said I was making her uncomfortable just by existing in the same space. The words landed like physical blows. Several passengers in first class turned to stare at Lauren, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust. An elderly man in row 5 shook his head slowly, his face twisted in disappointment. A businesswoman in row 4 actually moved her purse away from the aisle, as if Lauren's proximity might contaminate it. Kennedy and George, the Cross twins, had gone absolutely still. Kennedy's face was bright red, his head down, his whole body language screaming that he wanted to disappear. George had pulled his hoodie up over his head, trying to make himself invisible. And Lauren looked like she was going to be sick. Pearl's voice continued, still steady, still clear. There was no anger in it, no vindictiveness. Just facts, delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty that only children seem capable of. I want everyone to know something. My last name is Hammond. My father is George Hammond, and he's the CEO of Skyline Airways. The cabin erupted again. This time the gasps were even louder. A man in row 6 actually said, "Oh my God." Another passenger started laughing. Not cruel laughter, but the kind of shocked, disbelieving laughter that comes when you realize you're witnessing something absolutely unprecedented. Lauren looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Her eyes went impossibly wide. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak but had forgotten how. Jason had gone completely pale. He closed his eyes, his head dropping forward like a man who just watched his entire life collapse. But Pearl wasn't finished. And what she said next was the most important part. "But that's not why I'm telling you this story." She paused, and the pause was perfect. Every person on that plane was hanging on her next words. "I'm telling you because even though my dad owns this airline, even though I probably fly more than most adults, someone still looked at me and decided I didn't deserve to be treated with respect. And if it can happen to me, someone who technically owns part of this plane, imagine how many other kids, other people, get treated this way every single day." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. You could have heard a breath. Because Pearl had just articulated something that many passengers had probably never thought about, or had thought about but never heard expressed so clearly by someone so young. The injustice of it. The casual, everyday cruelty of judging people based on appearance, of deciding who belongs where based on nothing but prejudice. An African-American woman in row 7 had tears streaming down her face. She was nodding, her hand pressed to her chest like Pearl's words had struck something deep inside her. A Latino man across the aisle from her had similar tears in his eyes, his jaw clenched tight. Because they knew. They'd lived it. They'd experienced their own versions of what Pearl was describing, the assumptions, the microaggressions, the moments when someone looked at them and decided they didn't belong. Pearl's voice got softer now, more personal, and somehow that made it even more powerful. "My mom died when I was 4. She was an aerospace engineer. She designed parts of the engines on this exact aircraft model." Elizabeth's hand moved to her mouth. She hadn't known that. Hadn't made that connection. Maria Hammond, whose work was legendary in the aerospace industry, had been Pearl's mother. "She taught me," Pearl continued, her voice carrying the weight of a memory she treasured, "that where you sit on a plane doesn't make you better than anyone else. What makes you a good person is how you treat others, especially when you think no one important is watching." The elderly man in row 5 was nodding vigorously now, his eyes bright with unshed tears. A young couple in row 6 were holding hands, both of them visibly moved. And then Pearl turned slightly, looking directly at Lauren Cross, and her voice took on a different quality, not harsh, not angry, but absolutely certain. "Miss Elizabeth and Miss Diana did the right thing today. They protected me even when someone tried to pay them not to. That's integrity." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. It started in economy, where passengers who'd only heard the story but hadn't witnessed it were so moved by Pearl's words that they couldn't help themselves. Then it spread forward, through the premium economy section into first class, where even passengers who'd been trying to stay neutral found themselves clapping. Diana was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her mouth. Elizabeth had her arm around Diana's shoulders, her own eyes suspiciously bright. The applause continued, building, and Pearl waited for it to die down before she delivered her finale. So here's what's going to happen. The cabin went silent again, everyone waiting. Pearl looked at Elizabeth, then back at the cabin, her voice clear and firm and carrying the kind of authority that shouldn't be possible from an 8-year-old but somehow was. Miss Elizabeth, please remove passengers Lauren Cross, Jason Cross, Kennedy Cross, and George Cross from this flight. They're no longer welcome on Skyline Airways aircraft. The gasps were deafening. Lauren shot to her feet like she'd been electrocuted. No. You can't. But Jason pulled her back down, his face a mask of horror and resignation. He knew. He knew exactly how this was going to end. Pearl calmly handed the intercom back to Elizabeth, but she wasn't quite done. She looked up at the chief flight attendant with those serious, thoughtful eyes and added, just loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Also, Miss Elizabeth and Miss Diana are both getting bonuses. I'll make sure of it. Diana made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Elizabeth's smile was so wide it looked like it might break her face. And then Elizabeth took the intercom, her voice absolutely professional despite the smile, despite the justice of this moment, despite how satisfying it was to say these next words. You heard the young lady. Mr. and Mrs. Cross, please gather your belongings. Airport security is being notified and will meet you at the gate. Lauren found her voice then, standing up again, her face flushed red with humiliation and rage. You can't do this. We'll sue. This is discrimination. You're discriminating against us because of what, Mrs. Cross? Elizabeth asked, her voice ice cold. Because you attempted to bribe a federal employee to discriminate against a minor? Because you violated airline policy? Because you committed what could be classified as a federal offense under Title 18 of the U.S. Code. Lauren's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Elizabeth continued, relentless. Ma'am, you attempted to bribe a flight attendant to remove a passenger from her assigned seat based on nothing but your personal prejudice. You're being removed for violation of airline policy and potential federal law violations. Security will be waiting at the gate door. Now please gather your belongings so we don't delay this flight any further. The cabin was absolutely silent now, every eye fixed on row 3, watching this family's public humiliation unfold. Jason was already standing, already pulling his bag from the overhead bin. His movements were mechanical, his face blank with shock. The twins followed suit, Kennedy still bright red, George still hiding under his hoodie, both of them refusing to look at anyone. Lauren stood frozen for a moment longer, her designer purse clutched to her chest like a shield. She looked around the cabin as if searching for allies, for someone who would agree that this was unfair, that she was the victim here. She found none. Every face that met hers held judgment, disgust, or cold satisfaction. This isn't over, she tried one more time, her voice shaking. We have lawyers. We have connections. You'll all regret. The only thing I regret, Elizabeth interrupted, her voice still perfectly calm, is that you were ever allowed on this aircraft in the first place. Now move, please. Jason grabbed Lauren's arm and pulled her into the aisle. The family began their walk of shame toward the front of the cabin, having to pass every single first-class passenger who'd witnessed their attempted bribery and their subsequent exposure. As they approached Pearl's row, Lauren stopped. She looked down at the little girl who'd just demolished her life in under 3 minutes. Pearl had returned to her seat and was looking at her notebook again, her pencil moving across the page like nothing significant had just happened, like she hadn't just wielded power most adults would kill for with the kind of grace and precision that would make headlines. Lauren opened her mouth, and for a second it looked like she was going to say something, an apology maybe, or another threat, or some justification for her behavior. But Pearl spoke first, not looking up from her notebook, her voice quiet but clear enough for Lauren to hear. I hope you learned something from this. Lauren's face crumpled. She made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp or both, then rushed toward the exit, nearly tripping over her own expensive shoes in her haste to escape. Jason followed, his head down, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The twins came last, both of them looking utterly mortified, and honestly passengers watching felt a little sorry for them. They were teenagers. They hadn't asked for a mother who thought her diamond elite status gave her the right to discriminate against children. Security was waiting at the gate, just as Elizabeth had promised. 2 airport police officers in crisp uniforms, with serious expressions that suggested they'd been briefed on what had happened. As the Cross family stepped off the aircraft, one of the officers began speaking to Jason in low tones while the other took notes. Back on the plane, the moment the cabin door sealed again, the entire first-class section erupted. Passengers were talking over each other, recounting what they'd just witnessed, their voices filled with disbelief and satisfaction and admiration. The woman in row 7 who'd been crying was now laughing, shaking her head in wonder. The elderly man in row 5 was telling his seatmate that in 50 years of flying, he'd never seen anything like that. Several passengers called out to Pearl. "You're amazing, sweetheart. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Your parents must be so proud of you." Pearl looked up from her notebook, seeming surprised by the attention, and gave a small, shy smile. Then she went back to her drawing, like being praised by a cabin full of strangers was nice but not as important as finishing her wing design. Elizabeth made her way to Pearl's seat, kneeling down in the aisle so they were eye level. "That," she said quietly, "was one of the most powerful things I've ever witnessed. Thank you for standing up for us. Thank you for standing up for what's right." Pearl looked at her seriously. "They were going to try to get you fired. I couldn't let that happen. You were just doing your job." "We were doing more than our job," Elizabeth said. "We were doing what's right. But you showed everyone on this plane what real courage looks like." Diana appeared beside Elizabeth, crouching down as well. Her eyes were still red from crying, but she was smiling the biggest smile. "Pearl, I don't even know what to say. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to use your—" She paused, not wanting to say power or privilege, searching for the right word. "I had to," Pearl said simply. "My mom always said that if you can help someone and you don't, that's the same as hurting them. You helped me. So I helped you." The simplicity of it, the pure logic of an 8-year-old's moral compass, made both women tear up again. "Your mother," Elizabeth said, "sounds like she was an incredible person." "She was," Pearl agreed. "She would have liked you both." Around them, the cabin was buzzing with energy. Passengers were already pulling out their phones, texting friends and family about what they just witnessed. Some were recording videos, talking into their cameras about the most incredible thing I've ever seen on a plane. Within hours, this story would be all over social media. Within days, it would be on the news. But for now, in this moment, it was just a little girl in a wrinkled school uniform, sitting in seat 2A, going back to her airplane sketches like she hadn't just delivered one of the most powerful speeches anyone on that aircraft would ever hear. Elizabeth and Diana returned to the front of the cabin. Elizabeth picked up the intercom one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the extended delay. We'll be beginning our pushback shortly. Thank you for your patience." She paused, then added, her voice warm with emotion, "And on behalf of the entire crew, thank you for being such an incredible group of passengers. This flight is going to be one I remember for the rest of my life." The cabin applauded again, and this time it felt like a celebration, not just of Pearl's courage but of the idea that sometimes justice actually happens. That sometimes, people who do wrong actually face consequences. That sometimes a child's voice can be the most powerful voice in the room. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engine started with their familiar whine. Ground crew disconnected the various hoses and cables. The aircraft began to move, backing away from the terminal, turning toward the taxiway. Inside, Pearl was finishing her wing design, adding the last few calculations to the margins of her notebook. She was satisfied with it. Her mother would have been proud, not just of the engineering but of everything that had happened today. Diana came by with a warm towel and a glass of orange juice. "For you," she said, placing them on Pearl's tray table. "And if you need anything at all, during this flight you just let me know, okay?" "Thank you," Pearl said. Then, because she was 8 and this had been a very intense experience, she asked, "Do you have any cookies?" Diana laughed, the kind of laugh that releases tension and brings joy at the same time. "Honey, for you I'll find the best cookies on this entire plane." As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, passengers settled in for what would be, they all suspected, a much more pleasant flight than it would have been with the Cross family on board. The captain's voice came over the intercom, "Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." Elizabeth and Diana took their jump seats. Pearl fastened her seatbelt and looked out the window, watching the ground speed by as the plane accelerated down the runway. And then they were airborne. The plane lifted off, climbing into the Miami sky, leaving behind the airport, the gate, the humiliated family who'd learned a lesson they'd never forget. Inside the aircraft, Pearl Hammond, 8 years old, daughter of a CEO, child of an aerospace engineer, and the bravest person on Flight 2847, opened her notebook to a fresh page and began sketching a new design. Because there was always another problem to solve, another challenge to tackle, another dream to chase. And Pearl had learned, from her mother and from this day, that sometimes the smallest people can make the biggest difference. "Now I have to ask you something. After watching Pearl's incredible display of courage, after seeing how one 8-year-old girl stood up for what's right and changed everything, are you inspired? Do you believe in speaking up when you see injustice? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this story moved you the way it moved everyone on that plane, hit that subscribe button right now because we need more people willing to stand up for what's right just like Pearl did. Let's see how this story ends. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, something remarkable happened. The first-class cabin, still buzzing with the energy of what had just transpired, broke into spontaneous applause for the second time. But this time it was different. This wasn't the shocked, reactive applause that had erupted during Pearl's speech. This was appreciation, gratitude, celebration. Passengers were clapping not just for Pearl's courage, but for the flight attendants who'd stood their ground, for the principle of justice being served, for witnessing something that reminded them that goodness still exists in the world. The applause started in the front rows and rippled backward through the cabin like a wave, spreading from first class into premium economy and then into the main cabin, where passengers who'd heard Pearl's speech over the intercom were clapping for a little girl most of them couldn't even see. Pearl looked up from her notebook, surprised by the sustained attention. Her cheeks flushed slightly, she wasn't used to being the center of this much focus. She gave a small, awkward wave to acknowledge the applause, then quickly returned her attention to her sketches, clearly more comfortable with engineering calculations than with being celebrated. But the passengers weren't quite done showing their appreciation. An elderly gentleman sitting across the aisle from Pearl, he had to be in his 70s, with white hair and deep laugh lines around his eyes, leaned toward her. His voice was warm, grandfatherly, filled with genuine emotion. "Young lady, I flew bombers in Vietnam. I've seen combat, raised 4 children, built a business from nothing, and lived through more than 7 decades on this earth. And I want you to know that what you just did was the bravest thing I've seen in years." Pearl looked at him, her eyes wide. "Really? Really?" he confirmed, nodding solemnly. "Standing up for what's right when you have something to lose? That's true courage. And you did it with more grace and dignity than most adults could manage. Your parents should be extraordinarily proud of you." "Thank you," Pearl said quietly, and there was something in her expression, a mixture of pride and sadness, that reminded everyone who was paying attention that she only had one parent now, that her mother wasn't there to see this moment. The elderly man seemed to pick up on that sadness. He reached across the aisle and gently patted Pearl's hand. "Your mother would be proud too, sweetheart. Wherever she is, I guarantee she's beaming right now." Pearl's eyes got bright with unshed tears, but she smiled. She would have done the same thing. She never let people treat her unfairly just because she was a woman or Latina. She always stood up for herself and for other people. "Then you're carrying on her legacy beautifully," the man said. Around them, other passengers were sharing similar sentiments. A businesswoman in row 4 caught Pearl's eye and gave her a thumbs up. A mother traveling with her own daughter, who looked to be about 10, pointed at Pearl and said something to her child that made the girl nod seriously, clearly being told to remember this moment, to remember what courage looks like. Diana appeared beside Pearl's seat, kneeling down so they were at eye level. Her eyes were still red-rimmed from crying, but she was smiling the kind of smile that comes from deep gratitude. "Pearl," she said softly, "thank you for standing up for us. You didn't have to do that." Pearl looked at her with those serious, thoughtful eyes that seemed far too old for an 8-year-old. "Yes, I did. Those people were going to try to get you and Miss Elizabeth fired for doing the right thing. That's not fair. You protected me even when someone tried to pay you not to. You chose what was right over what was easy or profitable." Diana felt tears threatening again. "We were just doing our jobs." "No," Pearl said, and there was absolute certainty in her voice. "You were doing more than your job. You were standing up for someone you didn't even know. Someone who couldn't protect themselves. That's different." She paused, then added, in a voice that carried wisdom beyond her years, "My dad always says that having power means using it to protect people who need it. You and Miss Elizabeth needed someone to protect you today. So I did." Diana couldn't help it, she reached out and pulled Pearl into a hug. "You're an extraordinary person, Pearl Hammond. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Pearl hugged her back, her small arms tight around Diana's shoulders. When they separated, Diana was crying again, but this time they were happy tears, grateful tears. Elizabeth appeared behind Diana, having finished her final pre-flight checks. She looked down at Pearl with an expression that was part admiration, part affection, part awe. "How are you doing, Pearl?" That was a lot for anyone to handle, let alone someone your age. Pearl considered the question seriously. "I'm okay. I was scared before I started talking, but once I started it wasn't so bad. I just told the truth about what happened. The truth is easy. The truth is easy, Elizabeth repeated, savoring the simplicity of that statement. I'm going to remember that. She glanced at Diana, then back at Pearl. You know, we've been flight attendants for a combined 18 years. We've dealt with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, every kind of situation you can imagine. But we've never had a passenger stand up for us the way you did today. That means more than you know. You would have done it for me, Pearl said matter-of-factly. You did do it for me. When that lady tried to pay you, you said no. Even though $500 is a lot of money. Some things, Diana said firmly, aren't for sale. Not for $500. Not for $5 million. Integrity isn't something you can put a price on. Pearl nodded, filing that away in her mental catalog of important life lessons. The plane had reached the runway now, pausing as the pilots completed their final checks. The cabin had settled into the familiar pre-takeoff quiet. Seatbelts fastened, phones in airplane mode, tray tables up, seat backs upright. Diana gave Pearl's hand one final squeeze, then returned to her jump seat at the front of the cabin. Elizabeth did the same, both of them strapping in for takeoff. The engines roared to life, that distinctive building whine that every frequent flyer recognizes. The plane trembled with contained power, ready to launch itself into the sky. And then they were moving. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, faster and faster, the force pressing passengers back into their seats. Pearl watched through the window as the ground blurred past, as the nose of the plane tilted upward, as the wheels left the tarmac, and suddenly they were airborne, climbing into the afternoon sky. The flight was smooth, remarkably so. As if the universe itself was rewarding everyone on board for doing the right thing, for standing up against injustice, for supporting a brave little girl who'd refused to be diminished. As they climbed through the clouds, breaking into that perfect blue sky that exists above the weather, Pearl returned to her notebook. She had a wing designed to finish, calculations to complete, dreams to chase. Around her, the cabin settled into the rhythm of flight. Passengers pulled out laptops and tablets, opened books, put on headphones. The flight attendants began their beverage service, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. But there was something different about this flight. A warmth, a camaraderie, a shared experience that bonded everyone on board. Passengers who would normally never speak to each other were chatting across the aisle, sharing their reactions to what they'd witnessed. Several people asked to take photos with Pearl, who agreed shyly, still not entirely comfortable with the attention. One passenger, a young woman who introduced herself as a journalist, asked Pearl for an interview. Pearl politely declined, explaining that she had homework to do and wing designs to finish. The journalist respected that, but she did pull out her phone and start typing notes, already mentally composing the article she'd write about this flight. 3 hours passed quickly. The plane crossed from Florida into Georgia, then the Carolinas, then up the eastern seaboard toward New York. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Diana brought Pearl cookies. The good ones, the expensive chocolate chip cookies normally reserved for premium passengers, along with milk and fruit. Elizabeth stopped by to chat, asking about Pearl's airplane designs, genuinely interested in the engineering concepts an 8-year-old had taught herself. As they began their descent into New York, as the Manhattan skyline came into view through the windows, Pearl felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. Her father would be waiting at the gate. She couldn't wait to see him, to tell him everything that had happened, to show him that she'd handled the situation just like he'd taught her to, with courage, with grace, with the strength her mother had passed down to her. The plane touched down at LaGuardia with barely a bump, the smoothest landing Pearl had experienced in all her young flying career. As they taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings, standing up to retrieve bags from overhead compartments. But many of them stopped by Pearl's seat on their way out. "Thank you for your courage. You're an inspiration. The world needs more people like you. Your parents raised you right." Pearl thanked each of them, overwhelmed by the kindness but also eager to see her father. When the plane finally reached the gate, when the seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin door opened, Pearl grabbed her worn backpack and made her way to the exit. Diana and Elizabeth were there waiting for her. "We're going to walk you out," Elizabeth said. "Make sure you get to your dad safely." They didn't mention that they also wanted to meet George Hammond, to see his reaction when his daughter told him what had happened, to witness the reunion between this brave little girl and the father who'd raised her to be so strong. As they walked up the jetway, Pearl could see the gate area through the glass door ahead. And there, standing at the front of the crowd of waiting passengers, was her father. George Hammond was a tall man, well dressed in a business suit despite it being after hours, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten up when he entered a room. But the moment Pearl came through that door, all his CEO authority melted away, replaced by pure fatherly love and relief. "Daddy?" Pearl called out, and she ran, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, straight into his arms. George scooped her up in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground, holding her tight like he'd been worried despite knowing intellectually that she was safe. "My brave girl," he murmured into her hair. "My brave, brave girl." He'd gotten the full story, of course. Pearl had texted him the highlights, and then, in what might have been a violation of protocol but felt entirely justified, Elizabeth had called him during the flight to fill in the details. He knew what his daughter had done. He knew what she'd faced. He knew how she'd handled it. And he'd never been more proud in his entire life. When he finally set Pearl down, he looked up and saw Elizabeth and Diana standing a respectful distance away. He straightened, extending his hand. "Mr. Hammond," Elizabeth said, "I'm Elizabeth Park, Chief Flight Attendant. This is Diana Chin. We had the honor of flying with your daughter today." George shook both their hands warmly. "The honor was mine. Pearl told me what you did, how you stood up for her. Thank you doesn't feel adequate, but thank you." "Sir," Diana said, her voice thick with emotion, "your daughter stood up for us just as much as we stood up for her. She's the most remarkable child I've ever met." "She's her mother's daughter," George said, and there was such love and pride and lingering grief in those words that both flight attendants felt tears prick their eyes again. George looked down at Pearl. "I heard you gave quite a speech." Pearl ducked her head, suddenly shy. "I just told everyone what happened. And then I asked Miss Elizabeth to remove that family from the plane." "You did more than that," George said gently. "You stood up for what's right. You used your position to protect people who needed protection. You showed more courage and wisdom than most adults I know." He paused, then added, "Your mother would be so proud." "I know I am." Pearl beamed up at him, and in that moment she looked exactly like the 8-year-old she was, bright, happy, loved. They said their goodbyes to Elizabeth and Diana, with promises that the promised bonuses would be in their next paychecks and commendations would be added to their files. George also mentioned, casually, that if either of them were ever interested in management positions or training roles, they should reach out to his office directly. As father and daughter walked through the terminal, Pearl's hand tucked safely in George's, she told him the full story, every detail, every moment, every word of her speech. George listened, occasionally squeezing her hand, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief at the Cross family's behavior. "What happens to them now?" Pearl asked as they rode the escalator down to baggage claim. "They're banned from Skyline Airways," George said. "Permanently. Their names have been flagged in the airline industry's shared database, which means other carriers will know about the incident when they try to book flights." And Diana filed a formal report about the bribery attempt, which has been forwarded to federal authorities. Attempting to bribe a federal employee, which flight attendants are considered in certain contexts, is a crime. They'll likely face fines at minimum. "Good," Pearl said firmly. "They shouldn't be allowed to treat people that way." "No," George agreed, "they shouldn't. And because of you they won't. At least not on our planes." What neither of them knew yet, what they wouldn't discover until the next morning, was that Pearl's speech had been recorded. Multiple passengers had pulled out their phones during her announcement, capturing audio and in some cases video. By the time Pearl had landed in New York, before she'd even left the plane, those recordings were already being uploaded to social media. By midnight, Pearl's speech had been viewed 10,000 times. By morning, 100,000. Within 48 hours, over 15 million people had watched or listened to an 8-year-old girl dismantle racism with grace, intelligence, and the courage to use her privilege to protect others. The video went viral in the truest sense of the word. It was shared on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit. News outlets picked it up. First the local New York stations, then national news, then international coverage. CNN ran a segment. The BBC covered it. Al Jazeera discussed it. The story resonated across cultures, across borders, across every demographic imaginable. Because everyone understood the core message. That prejudice is wrong, that courage matters, that speaking up can make a difference. The Cross family became a cautionary tale, their names, though Pearl had used them in her speech, largely omitted from news coverage to avoid legal issues, but their story told nonetheless. They became symbols of the casual racism that still exists, the entitled belief that money can buy immunity from consequences, the dangerous assumption that some people matter more than others. Lauren Cross's social media accounts, which had been public, were deluged with criticism. Jason's business faced backlash, with some clients quietly distancing themselves. The twins, Kennedy and George, had to change schools to escape the notoriety. Whether they learned anything from the experience, whether Lauren ever truly understood why what she did was wrong, remained unclear. But they certainly faced consequences. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Diana became minor celebrities in their own right. They were featured in airline industry publications, interviewed on morning talk shows, invited to speak at conferences about integrity and courage in customer service. The $5,000 bonuses George had promised materialized in their accounts within a week. The commendations went into their permanent files, along with personal letters from the CEO thanking them for upholding the values Skyline Airways was built on. But for Diana and Elizabeth, the real reward was simpler. They'd done the right thing and they'd been protected for doing it. In an industry where employees are often told to appease difficult customers at any cost, they'd stood their ground, and won. As for Pearl, she went back to school the following Monday, notebook full of airplane designs tucked into her worn backpack, just another third grader with homework and friends and dreams of the future. She didn't talk about what happened on the plane unless someone asked. She didn't seek attention or interviews. When a major news network reached out requesting to speak with her, George politely declined on her behalf, explaining that his daughter was a child who deserved privacy and normalcy. But Pearl had changed something. Not just on that flight, not just for those passengers, but in the broader conversation about discrimination, about courage, about using whatever power or privilege you have to stand up for others. Her speech became required viewing in some diversity training programs. Teachers showed it to their classes when discussing civil rights and standing up to injustice. Parents played it for their children as an example of courage. And somewhere in all of that, a message took root. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages. Sometimes a child can see moral clarity that adults have lost. Sometimes doing the right thing requires risking something. Comfort, money, social approval, but it's always worth it. Pearl continued her studies, continued her airplane designs, continued working toward her dream of becoming an aerospace engineer like her mother. She flew regularly, always in first class when flying Skyline Airways, which was most of the time, and she was always treated with kindness and respect. Not because of who her father was, though the staff certainly knew, but because she'd earned it. Because she'd shown the world what it means to have courage, to have integrity, to have the strength to speak up when speaking up is hard. 5 years later, when Pearl was 13, she won a national science competition for a revolutionary wing design that improved fuel efficiency by 12%. The design was based on concepts her mother had developed, refined and improved by Pearl's own brilliant mind. 10 years later, when she was 18, she was accepted to MIT's aerospace engineering program with a full scholarship. And 20 years later, when Pearl Hammond became the youngest chief engineer at a major aerospace company, designing the next generation of sustainable aircraft, she often told the story of that flight from Miami to New York. Not to brag about what she'd done, but to remind people that standing up for what's right isn't just something you do when it's convenient. It's something you do especially when it's hard, especially when it costs you something, especially when you're scared. Because that's when courage matters most. But on that afternoon, as Pearl and her father drove home from the airport, as the sun set over New York City, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Pearl was just an 8-year-old girl who'd had a very long day. "Dad?" she said from the back seat, her voice small and tired. "Yes, sweetheart? Can we get ice cream?" George laughed, the kind of warm, loving laugh that comes from pure joy. "Absolutely. You've earned all the ice cream in the world." They stopped at Pearl's favorite ice cream shop, and she got 2 scoops, chocolate and strawberry, because if today wasn't a 2-scoop kind of day, what was? And as she sat across from her father in a small booth, eating ice cream and telling him more stories about her flight, about the nice elderly man who'd called her brave, about the cookies Diana had brought her, about the view of the clouds from her window seat, Pearl was just a kid having ice cream with her dad. Not a viral sensation. Not a symbol of courage. Not a champion of justice. Just Pearl. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Because at the end of the day, Pearl understood something that many adults never learn. You don't stand up for what's right to be celebrated or recognized or rewarded. You do it because it's right. You do it because someone needs to. You do it because if you have the power to make a difference and you choose not to use it, you're part of the problem. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages. Sometimes an 8-year-old girl with a worn backpack and a notebook full of dreams can change the world. Sometimes courage doesn't look like strength or aggression or loudness. Sometimes it looks like a quiet child, speaking clear truth to a cabin full of strangers, refusing to be diminished, refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. And sometimes karma doesn't just catch a flight. It owns the whole airline. Now before you go, I want to ask you something important. Pearl's story shows us that age doesn't determine courage, and that speaking up matters even when it's scary. So here's my question. Will you be like Pearl the next time you witness injustice? Will you speak up or will you stay silent? Let me know in the comments because the world needs more people with Pearl's courage. And if this story inspired you, if it reminded you that one voice can make a difference, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because stories like Pearl's deserve to be heard, shared, and remembered. Subscribe and let's keep celebrating courage together. Thank you for watching Pearl's story. Never forget, the smallest voices can carry the most powerful messages.